So look around the garage right now and try to figure out exactly what it is that I've been doing. Do you have a guess? If your guess was throwing cards in front of a high-speed camera until I hurt my elbow and then continuing to throw cards until 3 a.m. to try to get one more shot, you'd be right. But why was I doing that? The other day, just messing around with it, I found out that throwing cards looks really cool on a high-speed camera. And that made me want to understand the aerodynamics. How do cards fly when you throw them? Because I now finally have a tool that will allow me to see these things. So today, I have it all set up in the garage, and I have 3 questions that I want to answer. I want to see the air movement over a card edge on. I want to analyze it like a wing. I also want to see the air movement perpendicular to the motion of the card and see it like make vortices. And third, I want to understand why every time I flick a card, it sort of does this helical loop-de-loop, because it drives me insane. Look at that. Why can't you throw it straight? Turns out there is a reason. I was wrong about it on the first day of filming a couple months ago, and a lot of these shots ended up a lot more complicated than I thought they were going to be. So let's get into the analysis. Oh, God, I actually did hit the lens. Oh. I'm going to tell this story a little bit out of sequence from how I actually did the experiments, but a couple months ago I started trying to get edge-on shots of cards flying through the air. We're going to get to those in a bit, but I want to start with the perpendicular shots where the card is actually traveling away from the camera. One, because they're really cool. Oh, wow. That's what I'm looking for. There's so much complexity in the And 2, because I think the effects are a lot easier to explain. These perpendicular shots were actually the last things I recorded for this video, and that's what took many hours last weekend and the reason for my garage being a disaster area. And for a number of these shots, especially after I hurt my elbow, I was also cheating. For a bad, but at least consistently bad card throw, I found I could set the cards on a smooth table and hit them with the rubber drum sanding head on my Dremel. Shockingly, trying to throw a card by hand through the tiny volume visible to the camera was less than repeatable, so I'll begrudgingly be giving 1 point to the machines on this one. Let's ignore how the card is generating lift right now, but hopefully it makes sense that to keep itself flying level, it actually needs to be pushing the air down. In the absence of any forces except for gravity, the card would fly down in a parabolic arc. But as the card flies, it applies a force down on the air, and then the air pressure pushes back up on the card to counter gravity. The awesome thing is that when the card passes through fog, we can see that the air appears to get pushed down below the card, and the air above the card then scoots down to fill that leftover space. Long after the card has passed by, the air column it affected is still dropping down. But what's the scoop with these spirals? Turns out that we get spiral patterns like this every time that a wing is generating lift and that wing isn't infinitely long. So, all wings. In actual airplane design, these are called wingtip vortices because they are vortices that occur at the wingtips. If you've ever seen one of these sideways diagrams showing the air moving around a wing, that's a picture that really only holds perfectly in 2D. As the air hits the wing and compresses under the wing, it generates a high pressure zone. And as the air passes by the wing above, or if you want to think about it as pulling the wing away from the air above, you're generating a lower pressure region above the wing. This means that even though there's still air pressure everywhere, the total force on the bottom of the wing has increased slightly, and the total force pushing on the top of the wing has decreased slightly. And the difference in these forces is lift. Now if you stack a bunch of these diagrams next to each other, we've got a lot of area of wing at high pressure down here, and a lot of area of wing with low pressure on top. The bigger the wings, the more you can lift. But what's happening to the air next to the wing? Next to the wing, there's nothing to inhibit the airflow, so we're looking at an empty cross-section here. The pressure is whatever it was when it started. This shouldn't surprise anybody, it's just air, without stuff moving through it. The fun happens when we stack a couple of those empty two-dimensional frames next to our wing generating lift two-dimensional frames. Suddenly, we've broken the symmetry. we have this high pressure zone right next to the regular zone. Some of that high pressure air is going to leak out from under the wing sideways. Likewise, the regular air from next to the wing is going to leak into the rarefied region above the tip of the wing on the top. This sets up a circular motion that must occur at the end of any 3D object that generates lift. The trick with the card is that it's so narrow, it's almost all vortex. It's a really short wing, and we see these two enormous wingtip vortices being shed from the edges of the card as it passes through the sheet of fog. If you look closely, you can also see little mini vortices forming at the edge of the main vortex. I feel like in a clean enough system, you could get these little instabilities on instabilities on instabilities all the way down, if it wasn't for the Reynolds number changing as you scale smaller. It would actually be really fun to try to calculate how many levels of instabilities you could get for any given air density and temperature and like scale of card, but I'm not going to do that math today. Now, where I started with all this filming were the edge-on shots, where we actually get to see the card behaving like a wing traveling through the air. Okay, I think it's set up. And these shots also demonstrate some very cool instabilities. They were a bit of a challenge as well, because while the Dremel is a lot better than I am at getting the card to go to the same place every time, I wanted to get a few different angles of attack, and that was basically totally random. So it was a lot of starting the fog, shooting a card, stopping the fog, running back to the camera, rinse and repeat. Oh, there's the card. The first point I want to make here is actually best viewed at a less severe slowdown, and that's the total movement of air after the card passes by. Since we're looking at sort of the entire air column here, we're not seeing the wingtip vortices as clearly, but we do see all the air shift down after the card goes through. Okay, editing Brian here. I was going to leave this as like an on-screen note, but it was so cool. Sometimes napkin math really surprises you that I needed to talk about it. Knowing the frame rate of this footage, I can calculate that this card takes about 13 milliseconds to travel its own length in this footage, which means that it's actually traveling about 6.8 meters per second sideways. If acted upon by gravity alone, of course this card would not be traveling in a straight line sideways. It would be sort of following an arc downwards. And we can say that in that 13 milliseconds between right here and, I don't know, right here, then this card would have accelerated downwards by about 1/8 of a meter per second. So if it started heading downwards at 0 meters per second, at the end of this 13 milliseconds, it would then be falling at 1/8 of a meter per second. If we assume that this playing card weighs 5 grams, which I found somewhere on the internet as like the typical mass of a playing card, we can calculate that in that 13 milliseconds, when it accelerates downwards, it would have gained 64 gram centimeters per second of downwards momentum. That's what gravity would have done by itself. Now with some extremely vague estimates, I needed to measure the momentum of the air. So I measured the speed of this downwash, which you can do in the video footage relatively easily using the card as a ruler. That air starts moving downwards at about 0.8 meters per second, and although we can only see the air with fog in it, I assumed that the card was interacting with a volume of air that was about as big as it was. If we literally just add up all the momentum in this little hypothetical box of air, we get 70 gram centimeters per second. That is so close. 70 and 64 so excited I can't even speak. From a physics perspective, where we've made all of these really gross assumptions about how much air is moving and how fast it's going and all the air in the box is going the exact same speed, it's not interacting with anything else, we shouldn't be able to get this close. It's less than 10% error. In physics, you can get an awful lot done by remembering some basic conservation laws and then figuring out where all of your energy or your momentum or whatever other invariant you're working with is going. In this case, gravity didn't seem to be changing the momentum of the card, but gravity was still on, and that momentum had to go somewhere, and it went into the air. And I think that's pretty cool. Now back to your regularly scripted video. The more fun bit here is actually what's happening directly behind the card. I believe this is a form of Kármán vortex street. It's a weird state halfway in between turbulent and laminar flow, where the motion of a fluid is predictably oscillating. These leftover circles of air aren't the same vortices as the wingtip vortices. These are sideways, they're just vortices everywhere. These Kármán streets only form at very specific Reynolds numbers. If the card was going much slower, the air would go around it smoothly. And if the card was going much faster, the air behind would likely be completely turbulent and unpredictable. But we are lucky enough that a card traveling through fog at regular human-rated speeds and temperatures, it makes these awesome chains of spirals for us to enjoy. Now, while I think these patterns are awesome, the card, trying its darndest to just keep on flying through the air, thinks these spirals are awful. Forcing air to accelerate into loops like this wastes energy, and this is one of the many mechanisms that slows down the card while it flies. The general name for this is drag, but that's really just a catch-all term for any physical process that saps kinetic energy from the card and uses that energy to do something less productive. In case you're wondering, the wingtip effects are also a source of drag that actually is really important to consider in airplane design. Now that you're thinking about drag, think about angle of attack. If I push a card through the air like this, or I push a card through the air like this, which do you think, just intuitively, is going to experience more drag? If you've ever waved a board or a piece of paper around and found, oh, it's a lot easier to slice through the air like this, and when I do it this way, I generate a bunch of wind. The answer is not going to surprise you. This cuts through the air better. So clearly a card traveling through the air very flat at a low angle of attack is experiencing less drag. But now I've got a harder question for you. What do you think the vortices behind that card are going to look like? If we look closely at the start of these two clips, we can actually see the drag. The air is getting accelerated as the card shears past. That's where the energy is going, the kinetic energy of the card getting transmitted into the kinetic energy of the gas. These two clips have cards traveling forwards at slightly different angles of attack, and the narrower angle of attack creates a lot less turbulence in its wake. It's literally cutting through the air better. This is a fun comparison from a scientific perspective, but I really just love looking at the vortex ripples left over. And that really begs the question, what if we make those vortex ripples a lot bigger? If you throw a card a really long distance, eventually the flight sort of peters out. It pretty abruptly stops its stable spinning flight and peels upwards and sort of stops dead in midair. It's very bizarre. In these clips with the camera behind me, we don't quite have enough pixels to see what's going on, but let me show you what that looks like close up. When the card spinning slows down and it starts to lose stability, its angle of attack starts to increase. When the angle of attack gets too steep, this happens. Whoa! Oh my God! That's beautiful. An errant throw. It corkscrews. Despite the fact that in elementary school I planned to be an aeronautical engineer, I'm not actually sure if this loss of control is caused by a stall of the card, but after this loss of control, the card is absolutely in a stall condition, if we were thinking of it as a wing. At this really extreme angle of attack, the air behind the card is absolutely a mess. There's no friendly laminar stream of air over the card to generate lift, and all of the card's energy is being bled off to generate this admittedly awesome swirling mass of air. It's cool to look at, but it's awful for the flight of the card. Makes you wonder, can we really call it wasted energy after I've filmed it and we get to enjoy it? The card would say it was wasted. Which only leaves us one more question. Why the helical flight path? If you've never tried to throw a card, let me show you what I mean. If you're inside, it's just sort of an annoying twist to your aim. But if you're outside or in a large space where the card can keep going, you can actually get a card to complete a full helix in flight. It's pretty wacky. So if we have a card that's spinning while it moves through the air, what makes it want to turn sideways? My initial reaction to this was the difference in card speed, similar to opposite helicopter blades having slightly different dynamics if the whole thing is moving through the air. If you've got a card that's rotating while it's spinning, then the leading edge of the rotation here is actually traveling faster through the air, and this edge of the card is traveling slower through the air. And my instinct said, well, if it's traveling faster through the air, it's like a wing that's traveling faster and it should generate more lift. This turned out to be wrong on 2 counts, maybe 3 counts. First, I hope to be able to see that effect on the perpendicular shots. We should have seen a significantly larger downwash of air on the forward moving edge of the card if this were a substantial effect, but we don't. And the second problem that I think is the really obvious one that for some reason I hadn't realized right away is that if this leading rotating edge of the card was actually generating more lift, then the card would want to tilt this way. And it doesn't. When you throw a card and it's spinning, it actually rotates in the opposite direction. So this was not the answer. After reading up on the flight of disc golf discs, which actually curve in a very similar way when you throw them to a card, I realized that this is actually a form of gyroscopic precession. Now, I've had a partial script ticking around in my head for years now about angular momentum, and this is not the place to dive into it. But in general, let's say that gyroscopes are weird. When you poke a gyroscope, you end up modifying its spin and angular momentum instead of its regular momentum and position in the way that you might expect. For example, when I take this gyroscope that's free to move and I push up on this edge, it just twists back, exactly how you would expect it to behave. Now when I push up, it tilts sideways. This is weird. You shouldn't be able to push up on something and have it pivot around the location you're applying force. Like, this is just wacky. If you want to get mathy, this is because the gyroscope has a large angular momentum pointed down, perpendicular to the plane of spin. And when I push over here, I'm adding a new angular momentum this way, and the resultant angular momentum points over here, which results in a perpendicular spin that is slightly tilted. Yeah, it's pretty weird. The simpler to imagine explanation that I prefer is that when I push up on this side, I'm actually giving this little bit of the flywheel some upward momentum. So instead of continuing in its straight path, it actually wants to move this way. Since the whole mechanism is restricted by being tied to the rest of the flywheel and these bearings, the best way it can accomplish that is to actually tilt the entire mechanism. Really, we're just pushing on this little bit of flywheel mass and it's being deflected upward by the push that makes it tilt. I find this confusion very similar to the whole AC versus DC electricity thing. Like the DC version of Ohm's law, the nice, friendly, direct current law, always holds on an instant-by-instant basis. You can analyze alternating current circuits using those rules. People get confused because alternating current has been abstracted to this always oscillating, like steady state thing where you're looking at phase offsets and stuff like that. And it's complicated. Likewise, looking at angular momentum and trying to add up the angular momentum that already exists and showing how you're applying a torque in a weird direction doesn't really help me understand what's going on as much as using the linear momentum laws on individual bits of the rotor instead of trying to imagine the rotor as one big abstract thing. But what does this have to do with a playing card? Well, just like a gyroscope, a flying playing card has angular momentum. In fact, it couldn't fly without the stability it gains by spinning. This is a spinless throw, and it's pretty pathetic. In order to get this card flying through the air and spinning this way to tilt this way, we would need to deflect the front of the card up relative to the rest of the card. This originally baffled me because I am not an aeronautical engineer, and I assumed, oh, the card's a big flat object. When lift acts on the card, it's going to act through the center of mass, or it's going to act through the center of surface area, which for a card also happens to be the center of mass. And that is wrong. It turns out that for something flat like this, flying through the air, the center of pressure is actually slightly forward of the center of surface area and center of mass, which means that as this flies through the air, it's going to want to tip up. It's going to want to torque sideways. And if we look at the spinless throw again, yep, there it is. The card gets deflected upwards. Now, I wanted to see this for myself, so I did an unbelievably kludgy demonstration with a leaf blower, a card, and some string. Since the center of pressure is the same as the center of drag, this is very similar to a stability test on like a rocket with fins at the back or something. But unfortunately, my results were muddied by the card being flexible, bending, and just doing some weird stuff. Additionally, the fact that I was using a leaf blower was not producing the most laminar, perfect stream of wind tunnel air that you can imagine. Those caveats aside, when the string was attached to the leading edge of the card, Unsurprisingly, the card was nice and stable. But when the string was attached to the center of the card, it flopped all over the place because we were pushing from a location in front of the pivot point. The stability limit was actually probably somewhere around here. So somewhere in this vicinity, shoved slightly towards the front of the card, is actually the center of lift force on the card. Since a card that isn't tied to a string pivots around its center of mass, that means that every time a card flies, it's unstable, because we're pushing upwards, not on a location that is the pivot point. It's gonna want to tilt, and there's nothing we can do about it. But spinning the card allows us to cheat. When the card has angular momentum and it's flying through the air, it's unstable and there's a force that makes the card want to pitch upwards. But just like the gyroscope, we're redirecting that force and we're causing it to be a slight tilt sideways instead of the huge pitch forwards. That means that relative to the oncoming air, the card is still edge on the whole time and it's able to maintain flight. So if we look at these side by side, just like a gyroscope getting nudged upwards, the front of the playing card is actually moving sideways, and it's moving sideways really quickly. So the upward nudge doesn't move the whole card, it just sort of redirects the motion that's already there, which eventually causes the axis of rotation of the card to slightly tilt over. Over short distances, you can sometimes throw a card flat enough or actually like starting a little reverse tilted so that this really doesn't matter. And then you can get really accurate. Although sometimes if you don't have a soft backstop set up, that can end a bit too forcefully. That got stuck in the... I've done that to more than one. Look at this. Whoops. Someday I'm gonna move out of this house and the next owner is gonna go, there are holes in the garage door because of what? I hope that you enjoyed today's heavy over analysis of flying playing cards. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.